Gone are the days where we have to explicitly define each single service with all of its arguments, tags, etc. in services.yaml. Thanks to Symfony's autowiring feature, with a minimal configuration, we will rarely need to explicitly define our services. So this is what services.yaml looks like before autowiring. It has the explicit definition of all of our services. It's usually a file with hundreds of lines, and we can easily get lost within. On the other hand, with autowiring on, we will have a lightweight services.yaml with a minimal configuration, and all of the burden of defining services explicitly is taken away thanks to this feature. We are going to see autowiring in action by creating a command line that will be getting the weather forecast for us. This command will be using a weather service that will be making HTTP calls to an external forecast API, and this service will be autowired. So let's get started. Alright, let's create our project. We are going to use Composer with its create project command. So Composer, create project, and then Symfony skeleton. We are going to take the 6.3 version, and the folder name or the project name will be weather autowiring. So let's execute this command over here and let Composer do the rest of creating the project and downloading all the dependencies, and then we are going to open this project with PHP Storm. Okay, Composer is done. Here I have my project in PHP Storm. If we go and check on config services.yaml, we'll see that autowiring and autoconfig are enabled by default. And then I have this rule over here that says for the src folder, I want all classes to be available to be used as services, and their ID will be their fully qualified class name. There is 3 exceptions to this rule, which are src dependency injection folder, src entity folder, and src kernel.php file. So this rule over here will be eliminating the need for me to define services explicitly for the majority of cases. Still, there is some cases where I have to manually define my services, and we are going to have that case in our video actually. Please note that the last definitions will always replace the previous ones, meaning that if I define a service over here and then down in the file I define that service again, that's the second definition that will be winning over the first one. Let's close this file over here. The config within is sufficient for us to get going, but we will get back to this file later. So let's write some code, but before writing code, let's quickly review our project structure. We are going to have a class called weather command, which will have an attribute ws of type weather service, which is the second class that we are going to have. So upon this instance of weather service, we are going to call getWeather method, and we will give it latitude and longitude parameters. And this instance of weather service will have an attribute of type HTTP client interface. The attribute name will be HTTP service, and within the getWeather method, we are going to call HTTP service request, meaning that we are going to issue an a get HTTP request to our external API to get the weather forecast. So mainly we are going to create 2 classes, weather service and weather command. Let's start by weather service, and then we will get to weather command. So back in PHP Storm, let's go to src folder, and then let's create a directory called service. Within this folder, we are going to create a new PHP class. Let's call it weather service. For this class, we are going to have in the constructor an instance of HTTP client interface, as we said, but this class is part of HTTP client component, which is not available by default in a Symfony new project, so we have to install it with Composer. So within a command line, we have to execute Composer require Symfony HTTP client, and we will let Composer download this dependency for us in our project. Once done, we can, in the constructor of our weather service, call HTTP client interface. Let's import this class over here. So we are going to have an attribute of type HTTP client interface, which is called HTTP client. And then within the getWeather method, we are going to use this attribute to issue a get request to our external weather API. So our getWeather method should look like this. We are taking latitude and longitude as arguments, and then we are going to pass them along with other parameters to this endpoint over here, and the request will be a get request. and it will be done with HTTP client attribute of weather service. We are going to return the result to our weather command. So let's create this command. To create our command, we have two options. Either do everything manually, meaning create the class and override all the needed methods, or use a Symfony component called Symfony Maker Bundle. This component will allow us to generate boilerplate code for commands, controllers, tests, etc. It is very useful and it enhances developers' experience by avoiding to repeat ourselves and writing a lot of code for nothing. So to have this component, we need to require it with Composer because it doesn't come by default in a Symfony project. Let's do that with Composer. So we have to execute in a command line composer require --dev Symfony Maker Bundle. And notice that we are requiring this component only in dev mode because we don't want to have this component in our production. Let's require this component, and once this component is downloaded, we will have a command available for us that will allow us to generate boilerplate code for commands, controllers, etc. The command would be php bin console make command, and we will be prompted to give the command name. So it will be app weather, and that's it. Symfony will take care of generating the class and all the needed stuff for our command to work. So let's go to SRC and check. We have a new folder called command, and within this command we have a weather command class for us, and this class contains some generated code that will help us get started. We will basically update this code to make it respond to our need. So the first step will be to update the description. We have already the name set up, so it's okay for the name. Let's update the description, gets weather forecast. And then within the configure, let's define an argument called lat instead of arg1. It will be required, and the description will be latitude. We don't want options. We are only going to have two arguments, which are latitude and longitude. So I'm going to duplicate this line over here, and it will be lng. It is required as well, and here we will have longitude. So here in the configure we have defined two arguments, and then in the execute we are going to get those two arguments and call our weather service to get the weather for us. So to get an argument, you have already a code that does that. Please note that if you are not familiar with creating a Symfony command, I have already done a video on the subject, so you can check it out in the suggestion area. So here we are going to have, I'm going to remove all this code over here, and then we are going to get latitude. Let's duplicate this line and get longitude as well. And then here we should have an instance of weather service. How to get an instance of weather service? By simply declaring it in the constructor, and then Symfony will take care of the rest by injecting an instance of that to us. So we are going to override this constructor of our class. As first argument, let's define a private read-only attribute of type weather service. Let's name it WS, and that's it. Now we can use this attribute WS anywhere in our code, and it will be working like a charm. So here we are going to call this WS and then get weather. We will pass it latitude and longitude as arguments. Let's save the response of get weather into a response variable. Response equals this get weather. And finally, we are going to display the weather forecast in a table format. So I'm going to use a helper function called display forecast. So let's define here a private function called display forecast, which will take the daily forecast and then it will display the forecast in a table format. I will not go too much into details on how we display this in a table format because as I said, there is already a video that details that. It will be linked in the description box, and it will also be available on the suggestion area. So we are going to import our classes here. Let's import the console output, and let's import also the table class, and we have just to call this function over here, display forecast, and let's give it response of daily, and we should be okay to execute our command. So let's test it out. To test our command, we simply have to execute php bin console app weather, and then give it a latitude and longitude. Let's give some random values like those, for example, and see what we are going to get. And yes, our code is working. We are getting the weather forecast for the next 4 days. Notice that we haven't declared explicitly any service, and our code is working perfectly. Why? Because of Symfony's auto-wiring feature. So here in the defaults, we have auto-wire to true and auto-configure to true, and thanks to those two config over here, we have our command working without explicitly registering neither our command nor our weather service. To prove that, let's switch those two trues over here to false. Let's switch that to false and this also to false, and rerun our command to see what we are going to get as output. And here we don't have our command working. Instead, we have a message saying that there are no commands defined in the app namespace. So thanks to those two config over here, we have our command recognized by Symfony, and we have our service injected automatically to our command. We can go a step further and disable this code to see what we are going to have. But before, let's get the list of all the available services in our project. We can do that by executing php bin console debug container. It will give us the list of all the services, and if we go to the top, we will see that our weather command and weather service recognized as services by Symfony, and their ID are their fully qualified class name. So this config over here is what allowing us to register all the classes within src folder as services. Let's go ahead and command this part over here to see what will happen. Now let's command this part and re-execute this command again. We should have our weather command and weather service disappear from the list, and yes, we don't have them. So this config over here is indicating to Symfony to make classes in src available to be used as services. Now let's revert back to what we have done. So let's uncomment this and make those two values to true, and check again to see if our command will be working. So it's working. Nice. Now let's see how auto-wiring works for scalar values like string or integer values. For example, let's go to weather service. Within the getWeather method, let's say that we want to parameterize forecast days and temperature unit instead of having them hard-coded. So we are going to introduce two constructor arguments, which will be days and temperature unit. Days will be for the forecast days, and temperature unit will be for the temperature unit over here, of type int and string. So instead of having 4 over here, we're going to have this days. Instead of having the hard-coded value Celsius, we are going to have this temperature unit. Now let's try and execute our command to see if Symfony's auto-wiring will be able to guess those values. And we are having an error, which makes a lot of sense because Symfony won't be able to guess the number of days that we want or the temperature unit that we want. If it's an object, Symfony will know how to create that object, but if it's a scalar value like integer, string, boolean, float, etc., then Symfony won't be able to guess that value, and it's up to the developer to explicitly define that, which is the essence of this error message here, saying that argument days of method construct is type hinted int. You should configure its value explicitly. So we have to do that explicitly. We are going to do that in services.yaml. Within the default section, we are going to add a bind option, and then we are going to define those values over here. We have to take exactly the same parameter. So in weather service, we have to take days. Let's split the screen. So in services, we want to have days, which will be equal 4. Let's change it to 3 to see if we will have this affected in the output down. And then for the temperature unit, I'm going to copy this string. Let's give it Celsius. Now let's save and re-execute our command. And you should be seeing 3 inputs instead. Yeah, we have 3 inputs instead of 4 inputs in our console output. So thanks to this bind over here, we were able to define values for days and temperature units that are declared in our weather service constructor. Now this is one way of doing this. The other way is by explicitly defining our service and adding an entry under services key. So we are going to define a new service with ID app service weather service, which is the fully qualified class name of our weather service. And then we are going to pass 2 arguments. The interesting thing here is that we can pass only the needed arguments. For our case over here, HTTP client interface argument is not defined here, but Symfony will auto-wire it for us because it knows how to do that. And I have purposely given different values from the bind over here. So we have 2 days instead of 3, and we have Fahrenheit as temperature unit instead of Celsius, to make the point that the last definition will always win and replace the previous one. It is already noted here. Please note that last definitions always replace previous ones. So if we re-execute our command, we should have 2 days for the forecast and the temperature units should be in Fahrenheit. Let's re-execute our command. And yes, we have only 2 days for the forecast and temperatures are higher, so we are effectively using 2 as the number of days for forecast and Fahrenheit as a temperature unit. That's it for this video and for this first version of our weather command app. In the second version, we are going to have an enhanced. In the second version, we are going to introduce a second weather provider, and then our weather command will be depending on an interface rather than a concrete class, and we will see how auto-wiring will react to that. We are also going to define which provider we are going to pick in our application using an environment variable, and we will be introducing an expression in services.yaml to help us with that. That will be an interesting video to watch, so stay tuned. Meanwhile, you can answer the questions that I will be asking by the end of this video by commenting in the comment section. Thank you all for watching and see you in next videos to come.